Rangers fans, welcome to episode 7 of Rangers Recon, the premier place to become a smarter Rangers fan, a part of Ice House Media. Alongside Arthur Staple, I'm Andrew Chelney. Remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel for more content. Stape, I have to come clean with something really quickly. I might allegedly be just the slightest bit hungover. I haven't stopped smiling. The New York Knicks are back in the finals for the first time since 1999. I've watched this team win 15 games in a season and be the laughing stock of the entire league for most of my life. The Knicks are back. I can't believe it.
I see the blue and orange peeking out there. I figured you'd be pretty excited. Doesn't mean anything for the finals because my limited NBA knowledge, which comes through my son and some of my friends, say that the San Antonio-Oklahoma City series might be the true final because the East wasn't necessarily quite a powerhouse this year. But having said that, I don't think I've seen a run like this for a local team in a long time, just kind of powering through. I mean, I think back to the first couple rounds for the Rangers in '94, to go way back, when they lost one game, slicing through the Islanders in Washington, and it sort of seemed like they would be, they were ready and it was time and they were just cutting through, and then they, 2 7-game series to finally win it. And for fans who were around then, and I was a young man then, they were agonizing series, obviously. Matteau in Game 7 against Jersey, and then up 3-1 against Vancouver and nearly blowing it in the tight Game 7. So it doesn't promise anything for the finals, I'm sure, and I'm sure you're well aware. But that kind of dominance just hasn't happened around here, maybe ever. These first 3 rounds, it's been incredible. I saw the stat last night watching the game. They haven't lost in a calendar month in the playoffs. Yeah. That's insane to me. So now that hopefully they get some rest and watch Wemby and Shea beat each other up to the point of fatigue and injury to go 7, and then the city can go crazy for the finals for the first time. Gosh, since the year I was born is the last time the Knicks were NBA champions. Just to illustrate that, and I am an old man. So
the last time they won was 1973. So it's been a long time.
I was 1 year old. So yeah,
I was not quite on this planet for a very long time. But yeah, I mean, people can say what they want about the East, but the Knicks have won so dominantly that like the Bulls didn't do this, the Dynasty Warriors didn't do this, the Lakers didn't do this, the Heat didn't do this with LeBron. Like, this is unprecedented levels of utter domination. Like, this is not even close. I'm watching this year, and we will talk hockey in a second. I promise. But like, watching this team for as long I've watched them my whole life, and thinking, okay, when is this going to fall apart? When is something bad going to happen? And every time I turn the game on, and especially during the conference finals, when I'm watching it with people and we're all in collective breath watching this team, we're going, okay, like, wait, the Knicks are up by 20. Oh, they're up by 30. Oh my God, they're up by 40. Wait, what is that? Like, what is happening? This is insane. And like, it's truly been like, this is the level of basketball that I've seen from this run. They've lost 2 games, both by 1 point, and they played their worst basketball of the year in both of those games. And it's like they're playing 2K and they turned all the sliders to easy mode, and they're just like, I haven't seen this in hockey. I haven't seen this in this is something that I've just never seen before. Yeah.
It's fun to watch when you got, what is it? They go 1 through 9 really, and everybody's doing exactly what they need to be doing. It's, I'm not, like I said, I'm not a huge NBA guy, but watching them do what they're do, and it's not just hoisting up threes. I mean, they were making almost every one of them last night, but their offensive efficiency is so high. It's incredible to watch. And like you said, not something we see a lot from this franchise. And, I think for a long time, if you're a Ranger Knick fan, you were like, okay, the Knicks are a joke, but starting from about 2011 to 2017, and then picked up again in 2022, and up until last year, really, you were like, all right, the Knicks are a joke. They're out of it by Christmas, really, but I've got my Rangers. They're competitive. They're always going to be competitive, and at least we have that. And now somehow the tables have turned, and the Rangers are the ones that are going to be grasping for relevance. If the Knicks pull this off and win a championship, I don't know how James Dolan feels if he's the sort of person that says, at least I got one and I'm excited to have it. Is he going to turn around and say, hey, Chris Drury, New York Rangers, what's taking you guys so long? We did this with the Knicks. We'll see.
The joke on Twitter is one franchise has to sacrifice for the other. Like both can't be great at the same time. It's like, oh, the Rangers are terrible. Oh, the Knicks are dominating. Oh, the Knicks are bad. Oh, the Rangers are doing well. There's this running joke that one franchise always has to be good and the other one has to be terrible. I mean, maybe not in '94, but every
94 was as close as we got. But maybe they can circle it back around.
Fingers crossed. For this episode, we will dive into some what ifs for the New York Rangers. We'll keep it to the Drury era to keep it, recent and relevant for our conversation, especially when we get to the draft and et cetera down the road here in a few weeks. Stape, you want to start it off?
Sure, because I'm going to start it off with I think what a lot of the Drury haters feel is the original sin of his GM tenure, which is trading Pavel Buchnevich to the St. Louis Blues for a second-round pick, and Sammy Blais, who was advertised to Ranger fans as a guy who was going to be an effective top 9 player, big, strong, fast, can score, yada, yada. He was not that. He's a fantastic young man, very good to talk to, but didn't have anything close to the Rangers career that you wanted him to have. The, big knee injury also cost him too. Thank you, PK Subban. But really, Buch, that was kind of the first salvo of what we've known to be consistent in the Chris Drury era, which is no one is safe, no matter how popular or productive you are. He made that decision. They could have figured out a way to sign him for sure. And you look at kind of the contract that he signed when he got to St. Louis before he signed this last big one, which he, really hasn't lived up to. And St. Louis is kind of a mess. We can leave that part out. But they could have afforded to keep him and made some other changes. But it was clear that was one of the players that Drury wanted to see go, and traded him for a less than return, as usually happens with established young players that are still cost controlled before they get hit UFA. And I think it was kind of the first move that really kind of shook up the room. Buch had a lot of friends in the room. He was a mainstay on the line with Mika Zibanejad and Chris Kreider. He was a guy who played with a lot of exuberance, brought that youthful energy that I think now, after 5 years later, they're trying to recapture. I don't know that he would have been the linchpin piece that would have gotten them over the hump in 22 or in 24. But I am curious to hear your take on what if they had kept Pavel Buchnevich and kind of kept that top line together and going.
That trade is my Joker origin story. That is a trade that I hated when it happened. And the Rangers, by the way, hated it too. And that because they've been trying to fill that spot that Buchnevich has left since they traded away Pavel Buchnevich. That trade slightly better now because of Lafreniere taking that top line spot, but for years,
took a while.
It took multiple years and failed attempts, and insert whoever you want. They've tried dozens of players at this point to fill that spot, and only now has Alexei Lafreniere finally seemingly have taken that top line spot years later. That trade was one of the worst that I can remember from the standpoint of Pavel Buchnevich was somebody the Rangers really needed. The second round pick is nice, sure. Sammy Blais was somebody that you could have had on the open market, or a Sammy Blais type player. It doesn't have to be specifically him, but there were other players in that vicinity type of player that you could have had at the time. So trading away somebody that really fit into that top six, and not, he was, if you want to just look at eye test, he was great there. Analytically, he was awesome for them. He was really a play driver for the Rangers in that top line spot. And they traded him away for a second-round pick and a guy that, listen, he got badly hurt, so I can't, it's tough to really grade him when he didn't really play that long. He was out, but he could never replicate that type of play, even if he was healthy the whole time. So you trade down, and then you spend years trying to replace the guy you just traded. And people on social media love, just are strange to me, because I get these comments all the time. It's all good. I get these comments all the time that are like, oh, the Rangers couldn't have afforded to keep, which, yes, they could have, because the replacements that they got to fill out the roster, that they traded, like Patrick Nemeth, that they had to pay Arizona to acquire afterwards. Like all these Brian Reeves and Barclay Goodrow and all these contracts were more expensive than Pavel Buchnevich. You had to, Brian Reeves was not here for very long. Barclay Goodrow was overpaid. You gave Patrick Nemeth that big contract, and then you had to ship him out a year later. All of this money could have just been used to keep Pavel Buchnevich in the top 6, mind you. Most top 6 players, you got to pay a pretty penny to keep. He was not expensive for the role, and you traded him away, and you spent years trying to find another one. Like it's a horrible trade.
Yeah, I mean, I think seen in a vacuum, it's a bad trade, and when you expand it out to look at, and obviously it didn't hurt them that season, that 21-22 season, because Shesterkin was otherworldly, and the power play was what it was, and that that's not necessarily where Buchnevich would have shined, given the roster that they had. But yeah, when you go into a trade deadline, and they were able to, that was an incredibly successful trade deadline. Andrew Kopp, where that second round pick that they got from St. Louis ended up in Winnipeg. They got him. They got Frank Vetrano. You rarely see a team that's as successful as the Rangers are when you're going up to the deadline, needing 2 top 6 pieces and getting them, and getting the guys that fit in very well, and nearly got them over the top, to get to a Stanley Cup final. But it's, it is. I think if you look beyond that, when you get to the Kane Tarasenko next season, you definitely into a situation where, yeah, I think I would have rather to have the 25-year-old guy who's homegrown, who had grown into be a fan favorite. And I'll throw in the kind of the behind the scenes add on here that, Pavel Buchnevich's first game back with the Blues, he got the kind of the still photo welcome back, and then they showed him on the bench, and he was fuming. I mean, my understanding was he was furious about that kind of throwaway welcome back, and it was really one of the first guys, I think, that had been here, that had left and come back in the new GM era. And we were in St. Louis not long after that, and Buchnevich was hurt. So I was trying to find him to talk to him, because I had heard that he was upset, and I saw him, and I don't know him well at all. And being that he was hurt, he was obviously off limits media wise, but he was storming around the Blues arena looking for Chris Drury. He was really unhappy and was trying to express his displeasure. And I think it was one of those things that was noticed. It was a good season. It can get shunted aside. Winning cures a lot of ills. But I think knowing the things that we know now about what's gone on behind the scenes at Madison Square Garden for the last few years, and how players feel that they've been treated, guys that are no longer here, I think it kind of is of a piece of that I was really the first guy where you were like, that's kind of odd. Usually you trade a guy, especially a guy who didn't want to leave. You give them a nice welcome back. You let the fans give him a good ovation. You let his former teammates welcome him back, and you don't worry about it, because you, as the GM or the owner or whoever, you made the decision to get rid of him. So that was kind of a, like a eyebrow raiser right off the bat there. And like we said, we've seen more of that in the years past, in the years that have gone by rather. So yeah, it was kind of the first indication that things were going to be very different under this GM.
I am still angry. I'm angry about it.
You're angry all over again now. I'm taking away all the Knicks' goodwill. I feel bad.
I just it is very surprising to me still that you trade away somebody like that without real catalyst for doing so when you're cost controlled, you're young, and you're playing the top six. You're playing well in the top six, and for reasons that I don't, maybe you know what the answer is, but like I don't know what the answer is. You trade him away to St. Louis for a second round. Yeah, I mean Andrew Kopp is great, but there was no reason that kickstarted the desire to trade him away. So that to me is still one of the strangest parts about all of this is like Pavel Buchnevich was a unicorn in the sense that he was a cheap, relatively speaking, for the role, top six young player who everybody liked, who was playing well in his role, who was becoming, a really solid player for the Rangers. And then Chris Drury just goes and gets a second round pick and a middle six guy for him. Like that, it doesn't make any sense when you look at it from that perspective. Maybe there's something that I'm missing, but from that perspective, it just doesn't make any sense to me.
And now I'm also reminded, even though it was only a few years ago, Sammy Blais, 54 games as a Ranger, no goals.
Yep.
Traded him back to St. Louis for nothing at the end, in the middle of 22-23 season, and he couldn't miss the net if he tried. He was probably scoring goals from 70 feet out. I think it was 9 and 31 games for the Blues. So, yeah, it's one of those things. It was a real zero all around, and not a great way to kick off the Drury era. All right, you're up.
Yeah.
Now.
Number one for me is what if the Rangers went all in during the 2024 run? Whether that was Jake Gensel or some other name that I'm sure the Rangers called about or tried, because that was the year for them. 2022 was a surprise, really, in the grand scheme of things. 2024 was, okay, this is a great team. This is a potential cup favorite. Here we go. And their biggest additions were, Jack Roslovic and guys that are decent players in their role, but you put them in the top six. That's not where they're supposed to go. You put Jack Roslovic on the top line. That's not where he's supposed to go.
Right.
Why did you do that? Like that doesn't make any sense. That doesn't make any sense to me. And again, right, that hole that Buchnevich left, they tried to keep plugging and playing with these guys that were miscast as top line forwards. So what if they actually went out and, traded, I don't know, at the time, maybe it was Schneider, what was it, Kakko, or, maybe even Perreault in these conversations that, again, not for Gensel, maybe it's somebody else who knows, but what if they actually went all in and gotten a real top line scorer on that line? Would they have beaten Florida?
Yeah, I mean, we talked about Gensel, back in one of the early episodes, and again, it wasn't, my understanding was, I'm sure that Carolina did ask for Gabe Perreault at one point, but I don't think that was the holdup on making that deal. It was more whether they would trade Kaapo Kakko, which I think was a no-go for them in terms of sending him in the division, but obviously, again, hindsight, since they gave him up for a lot less than even renting a couple of months of Jake Gensel, who I think has scored more playoff goals at MSG than most of the current roster has scored. But yeah, I think, we look at recent deadlines, obviously the Rangers haven't really been relevant as buyers the last couple of seasons, so it hasn't mattered. But, we're going to see, I think, more trades, less guys, walking themselves to UFA and then being rentals. I just think with the cap being what it is, we're going to see a lot of long-term deals. We're going to see guys that are choosing their destinations, a la Artemi Panarin. So 24 may end up standing out for a long time as one of those deadlines that was kind of the last one of this era of finding impact rentals as a team like the Rangers, who were President's Trophy team. They were top of the league pretty much from start to finish that year, but they still had that need for another guy, another A+ guy to put in that lineup, and not getting it. You think about Alex Wenberg, I thought was a great acquisition, a guy who, as a third line guy, he kind of fit what they needed in the bottom six, but yeah, they, not being able to find somebody or not trusting whether it was Lafreniere or Kakko, to just have a consistent run on that top line and going fishing for something and ending up with Jack Roslovic basically for nothing, kind of 2:59 and 59 seconds on deadline day. That stood out as a miss. And then knowing that they couldn't get that extra goal in games 5 and 6 against Florida definitely made it sting a lot more. And especially now we've seen what they've become in the last couple of years. That one might, we love seeing, things from years gone by get blown up on social media and people taking these little isolated incidents and years later saying like, well, this was the turning point. This was it. This one might be it. You might be onto something there.
What is weirder to me is that they really, I don't want to say went all out for Patrick Kane, but they kind of did. Patrick Kane
it was redundant after you'd already gotten Vladimir Tarasenko. They're very, Kane is a playmaker and Tarasenko is more of a goal scorer, but age-wise, similar profiles, similar, stature in the NHL, and it definitely felt like, why are you getting two of the same kind of guy when you could maybe diversify and get something a little different? So it's those two kind of the last two buying deadlines for Chris Drury are not ones that you want to really point to and say this is going on the top of my resume.
Tarasenko was better by default just because he had two working hips to Patrick Kane's one at the time. But it was weird how it felt as if the Kane and Tarasenko year, Drury was buying more than the year that they were Stanley Cup favorites. It was like that also doesn't make sense to me from my perspective. Again, maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm missing something, but it's very strange to me that, okay, Patrick Kane only wanted to come to the Rangers and he's playing on one hip and the Rangers still traded a second round pick and, other small pieces to get him. And pretty much all he did was cherry pick a lot of the time in the offensive zone. And that wasn't super great to watch. And, or the on ice performance as well wasn't that terrific either. And Tarasenko was fine as a Ranger at the time, but that, trading for those guys in a year where, you lose in the first round to now you're like the best team in the league and all you have to show for it is Roslovic and Wenberg, like that dichotomy. It's a strange, maybe it's a thought process. Maybe it's we struck out. This is the best that we could get kind of situation. I don't know, but at the time it was strange. And even in hindsight, it's even stranger.
Yeah. I think it worked really well in 22. They really found a couple guys, and even a guy like Justin Braun, who actually played pretty well as a what seemed like could have been like a 7-8 defenseman. He did okay, especially playing as offside. So you hit on everything that year, and you just it can the deadline game can be a little addictive. You think it can work every time out, and I think even excusing what happened in 23 with we never sometimes with the Rangers, the big name appeals to the big boss. And so maybe, Kane was more of a Dolan insistence rather than a Chris Drury insistence. But that's ancient history now. So you can at least say that when you get to 24, we're an excellent team. We're in great position. We don't have to do anything because things have been really good, but we can be selective in what we want. And I just kind of maybe that thinking instead of, like you said, instead of just saying like, yeah, this is our opportunity, especially knowing what was to come just a couple months later with starting to kind of tear it all down. Why wouldn't you have gone for it? Why wouldn't you, you could say to yourself like, yeah, we're giving up a lot in Kakko. If he becomes something, huge in Pittsburgh, then we'll regret it. But if you got that Stanley Cup in the window, who cares? So that's a good one.
Nothing matters if you win the Stanley Cup.
Exactly.
That's all good.
You buy yourself a lot of goodwill for a long time.
That's right.
All right. My next one, when we talked about it before we started recording, you were a little surprised, but I think it speaks more to another larger issue with, in the Drury era. And I'm saying, what if they decided not to fire Gerard Gallant after the 23 season? And, Gallant was a polarizing figure as a coach. He definitely did some things that had a lasting impact, putting Chris Kreider on the penalty kill, who's become one of the premier penalty killers in the league the last 5 years. Putting that kid line together in the 22 playoffs, that was electric for a lot of that. Gallant was always he's definitely old school, a bit gruff, but, I think when you talk to people inside the team and from his past stops, he really is a player's guy. He lets players really run the room. He's not a big speech maker. I think people could certainly understand that from some of his press conferences. But he does, him and Mike Kelly had a good mind for what worked and what didn't. And I kind of felt like, to your point about talking about 23, when you have a team that's not as good as it was the year before necessarily, but still in a good position, they certainly should have beaten the Devils when they were up 3-1 in that series. And then they go on and, Carolina doesn't really beat them ever. So, you might be looking at another conference final trip.
Yep.
If you're giving a team that's needing some stability, Tarasenko and then Kane, and said, you got to use these guys in certain situations. There was a kind of a well-documented, at least by me, blow up between Gallant and Chris Drury during the middle of that playoff series with Jersey. I'm sure that was the thing that sealed his fate once they ended up losing. And I think you saw a lot of conversation from the room, whether it was on the record or a little veiled, about they wanted a coach that was a little bit more involved, a little bit more, a little bit more structured, a little bit more responsive, a little bit more this, a little bit more that. And, to me, when you step back and look at the big picture now they brought in Peter Laviolette, who's a guy who's very attentive to detail and very attentive to what's going on in the room, and had the best Rangers regular season they've ever had in his first year. And he was out after a year. And now Mike Sullivan's here. And we'll see what happens in the next couple of years. I think Mike Sullivan, because of the length of his contract and his stature, I don't think he'll be out if they're bad next year, but who the hell knows, So to me, you get on this treadmill of, cycling through coaches every couple of years and now cycling through rosters. You have no stability. You cannot lay a foundation of any kind, whether it's stylistically, whether it's personnel. And I think the Gallant firing, even if once we knew that that GM and the coach were such at odds that it was probably inevitable, I think only giving him 2 years, and one of those years they're essentially holding on to a lead in Game 3 against Tampa away from reaching a Stanley Cup final. I don't know that you can dismiss out of hand that this was a guy that was not a good fit for them, because nobody seems to be a good fit for them coaching wise, which is what we've learned the last couple of years.
It's interesting because we were talking about this before we went live, that if you're not in the locker room, if you're a fan looking in, as I was at that time, I was not in the locker room for Gallant's era. There was this sense that Gallant was kind of, he acted like he was the smartest guy in the room, and he was somebody that didn't explain things very well, and he came across as somebody that seemed to think that he knew better than you. And it's interesting that because we were talking about this, that from your perspective, somebody that actually talked to him, it was almost the reverse of that. So I'm interested as to why that is particularly. And, there were things that Gallant did well for sure, but there's also, a lot of question marks there that I would have to think led to Chris Drury and him having a heated argument about it during the playoffs. So I guess, why do you think, and maybe you can explain this, why is there such a disconnect between what the fans saw in Gerard Gallant to what you saw?
I mean, I think it's early in Chris Drury's tenure, right? So people will give him a lot of leeway. And Gerard Gallant, not the most eloquent guy in interviews. He's a much better guy to talk to one-on-one. He's got a little of that old school, whether it's Torts or Joel Quenneville, one of these coaches that's been around a long time that doesn't suffer questions that they don't want to hear very well. He had a couple run-ins with a couple of the beat writers, which I don't applaud, and he was embarrassed about. But excuse me. I just think it's communication as a coach within the room is very different than communication to the outside world. And there are coaches like John Cooper, who handles the media exceptionally well and can explain things and maybe reveal things that a less confident coach or a more secretive coach wouldn't want to. And then there's guys like Torts who communicate just fine, but maybe put the spotlight a little more on themselves to take it off the players. It's, a lot more calculated, I think, than people think it is. And I think with Gallant, it really is just, I think his concepts, he's a guy that really, whether you like it or not, he lets professional players be themselves. He doesn't have a lot of tight rules. He doesn't have a lot of these things. I think he's how you'd want, if your kid was a 25-year-old professional athlete, that's who you'd want coaching him, a guy who understands what it's like to be a professional player, doesn't put a lot of restrictions on them, just says, show up on time, do this, do that, play the way we want you to play. I think when we think back to some of the the things that didn't happen under Gallant's watch, the kids not progressing the way we wanted. Well, Alexis Lafreniere, didn't progress very well under any of his coaches until last year, and certainly didn't have enough of an impact on it being a good team. And I think back to that 22 playoffs where we saw Alexis Lafreniere pretty much at his peak so far. He was great in that postseason. Capo Caco, similar. I think that line, that kid line was put together out of necessity because they didn't really have spots for them up in the lineup. And certainly after the deadline, there was no room for them in the top six because they had Kopp and they had Vetrano. But I think Gallant maybe has a little less credit given to him because a lot of those guys that we wanted to be further along in their development were not, and said, okay, well, he's not developing them well. Well, most of those guys are gone now. So it just didn't happen for them as Rangers. I don't know that you can put that on a coaching staff. And again, maybe the inarticulation to the fans is one thing that totally understand. Peter Laviolette and Mike Sullivan are guys that, they're not always the warmest and fuzziest, but they do come across a certain way. And, Gallant's a little bit gruff, a little bit rough around the edges. He's not wearing $1,000 suits or anything, but I thought, given the environment that he was in, given the talent that he had, I thought he did a really good job as a Rangers coach. And I thought he deserved at least another crack at it the next year without a deadline that ended up kind of, changing the room to the worst effect. The fact that they didn't have any pushback against that youthful Devils team when they were already up in the series and seemingly coasting. Those first two games were a joke. The Devils were deer in the headlights. If you can put that on the coach, that's one thing. But I think if you can say that you have a roster of guys that didn't step up into the moment when things got a little bit hairy, well, we saw what Chris Drury did with the team, less than 18 months later. He decided the same thing was true. So I don't know that to me, Gallant should bear the brunt of that blame for what happened in 23.
Fair enough. My next what if the Rangers decided not to give Igor Shesterkin that big contract extension? I am firmly on the team of you give Igor a blank check. He's one of the greatest goalies in the world, and you do what you need to do to keep him, because you try to find another one. There's maybe 28 teams, 29 teams, maybe 30 teams that would do anything to have him on the team, especially teams like Edmonton, right? That have been doing the goalie carousel for what seemingly like 30 years now of trying to find a goalie and it just never working out. And you find a guy like him and you keep him for as long as you can. What if Chris Drury saw what was happening with this roster and said, actually, what if we traded him and got a haul for him and retooled that way? And because you have guys like Carter Hart that have come back from the league, and my opinion is that he probably shouldn't be in the league, but that's neither here nor there. Carter Hart is not Igor Shesterkin, and yet the Vegas Golden Knights are one win away from the Stanley Cup final, right? So there's this argument that you don't need an elite goaltender to go all the way. And maybe the argument kind of falls apart when Bobrovsky was incredible for Florida in those 2 years that they won the Stanley Cup. But there is this contingent of fans and people in the media that think, okay, maybe there's something to the idea that you might not need a Shesterkin to win you games when you have all this top end talent elsewhere. So what if Drury was part of that contingent, that he said, okay, he's the best on the planet, but you need the best players in forwards and in defense, and in the goalie you can kind of hide him a little bit. We should trade him. What if that happened?
I think, like you said, there'd been a lot of teams lining up for him, and I think he'd have this same contract or something similar, just in a different place. I do kind of wonder. So let's say, this was the first year of his deal. So it's kind of moot, because if he's walking to free agency before, in the summer of 25, let's say he's the guy that's out there, and Florida is coming off its second straight Stanley Cup. Does Florida have the stones to move Bobrovsky out and bring in Igor Shesterkin right off of that? I doubt it, but I do kind of wonder if those stars had aligned, if this was the summer when they both were up, if Florida would say, you know what, Bob, you've done us an incredible service, but I think we're going to give your 10 and a half, 11 million to this guy. So it's interesting to think about that kind of stuff. And yeah, I think he'd be elsewhere. And the one thing, as you were talking, that came up in my mind was, what if Igor said no? What if Igor said, I'm gonna see where we're gonna be at, because 24-25 was such a turbulent year. He did sign in the middle of it to kind of take all the mystery away. But if he went to the end and saw again what was happening in last off season, would he say, yeah, I don't think I want to commit here? It's a curious one to me, because obviously he'll be a main reason why they turn it around when and if they do turn it around. But if it goes a couple more years, is he going to say, I don't know if this is tougher for a goalie and tough with a guy with that contract to suddenly say in the middle of it, I'd like to be somewhere else. He's not McDavid. He's not Austin Matthews. You can't just pick, you can't just drop an 11.5 per into anybody's lineup, even with the cap being what it is and goaltending being what it is. But yeah, I think if they had decided not to sign him, if it just hadn't happened and walked it to free agency, this season would have been a very interesting one. And I feel like you look at the carousel of goalies, even just backups for him, when they got rid of Georgiev, that was not a good mix. Jaro Halak was here. They found Jonathan Quick. I honestly think, we saw Jonathan Quick as a starter when Shesterkin was out for a few weeks. Didn't look good. I'm sure that contributed to Jonathan Quick deciding to hang him up. But yeah, I think when you don't have a Shesterkin, I understand it's a big commitment and the team is not necessarily where you want it to be, to have a goalie making that much money and being that big a part of your franchise. But much like with Buchnevich, you will spend a lot of your time looking for a similar guy for cheaper. And you look at some of the teams that have been doing that. And I understand we've got a Final Four right now where you wouldn't say any of these guys is a franchise goalie. Maybe Jakub Dobeš could be that, but none of them are far and away amazing goalies that you're like, okay, well, this guy's going to get 7 million or 8 million or 9 million next year if they're free agents. And yet one of them is going to be a Stanley Cup champion. So I understand that argument, but you look at the teams around them, even for, a Montreal or a Carolina, where it's a team that hasn't, been lights out for years and years in the playoffs. And you look at the Rangers roster and you say, boy, we need Igor Shesterkin on this team if we're going to have any success. Because if you subtract that and you have all the other pieces that are moving, I think you'd be looking at a lot longer turnaround time.
I don't disagree. I mean, I think Igor is one of, if not the best goalie on the planet. And if you trade the best, you look, I'm not comparing Igor to like Wayne Gretzky, for example, but Wayne Gretzky, when he was traded, they did not get equal value for him.
No.
They got a whole bunch of, you trade $1 for a bunch of nickels and a quarter, hoping that you could turn that into $1, and it never ends up happening. That's another issue when you have, I don't want to say a crossroads, but kind of a question when it comes to what do you do with your best player. When your best player is at the age that he is, and he's not 38, like, he's still got a long time to play at the peak of his career. You want to trade and you want to get rid of him. Well, you're not going to get the value that you would want ever. So it's either you give him the extension or you trade him for pennies and nickels and hoping that they could turn into something great. But when you invest pennies into the stock market, the returns are not great.
Yeah. You're not getting good value for an expiring contract of a goalie. It's just, I think history has shown it's just hard to drop a new guy into a contending team and have it be a success. So, it would have been an interesting trade and probably one that we'd be talking about an awful lot on this show, and not in a good way.
Last one for you.
All right. More recent one. What if the Rangers decided to sign K'Andre Miller rather than trade him last summer? K'Andre Miller looked pretty good last night. That was maybe his best game of the playoffs for Carolina, and they're 2 wins away from a Stanley Cup final. He's been really good for them all year. He was really good as a Ranger, even with his flaws. I think Carolina is a system that suits him a little bit better. It kind of plays more to his strengths in terms of being an aggressive player, being a guy who uses his feet well, moves around the offensive zone well. I think the way that they play in the D zone takes a little bit of the burden off him in terms of making, decisions that might be spotlighted a little bit. But, I don't think he was traded because the Rangers didn't like the way he played. It was a contract year. I'm sure he was looking for something long-term. He certainly got that from, 8 years and $60 million from Carolina. So that's as long-term as you can get. But to me, if you're looking at the what if of them keeping him, I think it would be interesting. I would have loved to have seen a K'Andre Miller, Adam Fox top pair for a long, long time on this team. It would have forced them, instead of going out and getting Vlad Gavrikov, which I don't think they would have been able to work cap-wise, you get maybe 1 or 2 second or third pair guys who are a little bit more untested. But I feel like, and I like what Gavrikov brings, and I think he's going to be a guy, if he wants to be here and he fulfills his contract, he's a very good partner for Adam Fox, and that's going to be a good top pair for a long time. But I think if you have Miller and Fox as your top pair, you force your depth to be better. You force yourself to use your pro scouts and use your trading skills as a GM to find better guys than they've got in their second and third pair right now. And I think we saw, especially with Fox out, that they just don't have any depth there. It was nice to see Matthew Robertson come through. Will Borgen is perfectly serviceable. We talked about his contract. We both hate it. There's nothing you can do about it.
15 games, all it took.
Drew Fortescue could be good at some point. I don't think he's quite ready for that yet. But I feel like if you keep K'Andre Miller for whatever, if they gave him that 8 years and $60 million total, and those are your 2 guys at the top of your food chain, even when Adam Fox is out, you've got a dynamic, guy who moves well, who can be an offensive force in K'Andre Miller. Would have been interesting to see him running, kind of quarterbacking that power play 1, seeing what he could do with it. It's a skill he hasn't really developed much in his career. I think they cut bait on K'Andre Miller too quick. And I understand his flaws, but I feel like, man, watching him play now and knowing that Carolina doesn't need him to be a 27-minute-a-night guy. They've got Jacob Slavin. They've got, they're a very share and share alike type roster. And maybe this will be the year that they can get over the hump and win a Stanley Cup. And boy, if that happens, I kind of feel like K'Andre Miller made a big difference for them. And the fact that the team that is widely regarded as kind of one of the shrewdest teams when it comes to cap space and roster allocation decided that, they made this trade. Scott Morrow, we haven't really seen a lot. It doesn't seem like Mike Sullivan's a big fan. They're going to end up with a pick, an extra pick in the late 20s and then an extra second-round pick. All fine to help a team that's trying to turn it around. Not on the timeline the Rangers have said that they want to turn it around, but good to have those assets. But to me, watching him possibly become a Stanley Cup champion at age 26, that's a missed opportunity. That's a guy you wanted to keep for me.
I agree. I think K'Andre Miller definitely had flaws. He had issues, and it was when he was here, sometimes it was, what version of K'Andre Miller are we going to see? And that's not even per game. Sometimes it was per shift. Yeah. There would be shifts where he looked like he was Brian Leach. And there's other times where he's giving up the puck right down the middle and it turns into a goal against. And you're thinking, what did you just do? Why did you do that? And it was, I think that duality of man that I think led to Chris Drury thinking, okay, like this guy could be good, could be great. Also, don't know what he's doing like 30% of the time, but it seems too high for me. So let's sell high on him and have him be either somebody else's problem or somebody else's project to fix. But K'Andre Miller had the tools in the toolbox to really build something great. And I think, as frustrating as he was at times here, the Rangers again are trying. They traded, they got the first, second round pick, sure, but Scott Morrow was supposed to be the K'Andre Miller replacement. He was the offensive defenseman that was supposed to be the next iteration of somebody that can handle the puck, maybe be a second power play quarterback, that somebody that could. It's not all on Adam Fox. Have somebody else do it. That was a lot of what Miller was doing here as a Ranger. And so you trade him away, and then lo and behold, because the Rangers didn't learn the lesson with Buchnevich, now they're trying to replace Miller with a different K'Andre Miller, and it's not working. And K'Andre Miller is doing really well with Carolina, as Buchnevich was in St. Louis when he was traded. And both were around the same age too. And I get the crossroads. I understand, the issues that Miller had, but when he was on as a Ranger, he was very impressive. And I think, they got a haul for him, sure, but the haul makes sense if you are in a rebuild, which the Rangers famously are not in one. So they want to call it a retool. They will say anything other than rebuild. Okay, well then why'd you trade K'Andre Miller for picks? And Scott Morrow doesn't even play. And so what was the point of that if you're not tearing this down? Because the timeline, again, they don't add up. That doesn't make any sense. So why did you do it? Yeah.
Speaking of that 22-23 season under Gerard Gallant, that was a season where Miller had 43 points. I think he was maybe in the top 10 among defensemen for 5-on-5 points. That was kind of the peak of what we saw, and that was year 3. And it didn't really progress far enough beyond that. And I understand you got to put some of that on the player. You got to put some of that on changing coaches and changing, assistant coaches who coach the defense and all that stuff. But it's to me, that's going to stand out as a missed opportunity.
Last one for me is, what if the Penguins overachieved in Mike Sullivan's last year in Pittsburgh and he doesn't leave to coach the Rangers?
Oof. So you're saying they've already fired Pierre Laviolette?
Yes. So they have fired Chris Drury has wanted Mike Sullivan since day one of him taking over as GM. That's been the worst kept secret in all of sports. Chris Drury wants Mike Sullivan to coach Rangers. Like, this was the day one, quote unquote headline. Like, everybody knew this. This was an open secret. This was something that, nobody denied. Like, this was, pretty well known. So, he couldn't get him when he was first hired. He got Gallant. Then he couldn't get him again. So he hired Laviolette. What happens if the Penguins just do so well that final year where Mike Sullivan says, I can't leave now, or Pittsburgh doesn't let him leave and he stays in Pittsburgh? Now what happens?
I think we might be looking at another, whoever they brought in. I'm trying to think of who was available last summer that they might have even wanted to talk to if they didn't get to talk to Sullivan. It wasn't a very long list of guys. Obviously Bruce Cassidy wasn't available then. I guess Dean Evison was available. I think it would have been a situation like Gallant. They would have gone with kind of the next tier of veteran coach. Maybe they would have interviewed some other guys that weren't, guys that you necessarily would have thought of, but I don't know that that's the Rangers MO to try this out with a new coach. So I think it would have been a veteran coach. They would have had a bad season if we're still assuming that in evidence. And I think we would have been right back where we were. I think we would have been talking about whether they were going to change coaches in, because guys like Bruce Cassidy were out there. Again, we talk about that treadmill. Once you get on it, it is hard to get off. And you make the decision on Gallant, fine. You make the decision on Laviolette, okay. Hard to pin the failures of those seasons where the coaches were fired on either of those guys because of the personnel that was changing, and certainly the way it was changing in a major way after last season. I don't see what would be any different in terms of the thinking of the owner and the GM after this season. I don't want to say that if you're the boss and you have a guy under you and your boss is saying, what the hell is going on? Are you going to say like, yeah, that's all me? You might point the finger at the guy below you. So I don't know how that dynamic would work. Mike Sullivan has plenty of juice in that organization. They've spent a lot of capital to bring him in. So yeah, I think it's still something to watch if they're bad next season. I don't know if we'll hear about some friction between the GM and the coach like we did with the previous two coaches. But yeah, I don't know that we're in a situation where James Dolan is going to look at this team if they're not successful again next year and change his mind about Chris Drury. So yeah, even with Mike Sullivan here, I don't know that any coach is safe behind a New York Rangers bench at the moment.
It's not the greatest look when you're the worst team in the Eastern Conference. So when that happens, you get there's let's just say there's a lot of noise coming from every possible direction, and I don't know how much you mentioned Dean Evison or guys like that. I don't know how much they would have changed record wise. I think Mike Sullivan is a great coach, and when he's here and your team is still the worst team in the Eastern Conference, probably speaks more about the roster construction and the direction of the franchise more so than Mike Sullivan's direct coaching. So, I don't know if insert name here would have done a better job than Mike Sullivan. But I think this question more so isn't about like this past year, but it's more about what would have happened, like let's say this year with Bruce Cassidy in Vegas being really weird about it. Like, would they have let insert name here go and really gone after Bruce Cassidy? Would they have continued to try to find somebody else? Or, if they don't hire Mike Sullivan and they fire another coach, then is Drury fired? Like, does Dolan have enough of this carousel? Does he want out? It's about the domino effect really that happens if Mike Sullivan doesn't get not only hired, but given that big contract of, okay, well, Chris Drury went 0-3 for hiring coaches that he really wanted, right? Ultimately, Gallant was not his first choice. Laviolette was not his first choice. So if he went 0-3 on first choice coaches, that might be enough for Dolan to say, okay, like you've had 3 shots and you're 3 strikes, you're out. Like, we can't let this continue. Maybe that would have set aside a whole new, domino effect, or maybe everything would be exactly the same. It's tough. It's tough to think about it now. Maybe we'll know more in a couple of years from now when hindsight is we have the better beneficiary of that. But I think we probably would have seen more either dramatic or drastic decisions being made if Mike Sullivan wasn't hired.
Yeah. And again, we may see some more anyway, even though he's here.
Maybe. That will do it for this episode of Rangers Recon. Hey, by the way, don't leave. Hey, before you go, like the video, subscribe to the channel. We will go live every single Monday. We got plenty of content coming up here. What is your Rangers what if? Put that down in the comments below. Stape and I will talk to you next Monday.